I wasn't planning on spending much time in South America. It was supposed to be a quick trip, mostly to see the sights and tick some destinations off my bucket list. I was 29, living in a small apartment back in the States, and I had saved up just enough for this one trip before diving back into the monotony of work. I landed in Bogota, Colombia, in June 2019, ready for a short adventure. What I didn't know was that I'd stumble into something I still can't fully explain. After a few days in the city, I wanted to explore the countryside. The mountains and vast forests called to me in a way I hadn't expected. I rented a car and started driving south. My plan was loose: visit a few small towns, hike a bit, and just enjoy the change of scenery. One of the locals had told me about an old trail near a village called San Mateo. It was off the beaten path, but it led to stunning views of the surrounding valleys. I wasn't an experienced hiker, but I figured I could handle a day trip. The directions were vague. Just follow the road until it turns to dirt, then keep going until you see the trailhead. It sounded simple enough, and I wasn't worried. The drive to San Mateo was beautiful but isolating. As I left the main roads, the villages grew smaller, the houses older, and the people scarcer. I passed a handful of farms, their fields stretching out toward the forested hills. Eventually, the paved road turned to gravel, then to dirt. My car kicked up a cloud of dust as I drove deeper into the countryside. I reached the trailhead in the early afternoon. It wasn't much, just a small wooden sign leaning against a tree. The path was overgrown, with grass and weeds spilling onto the trail. I parked the car on the side of the road and packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a flashlight. The hike started uneventfully. The trail wound through dense forest, the trees casting long shadows despite the midday sun. The air was thick and humid, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. It felt peaceful, almost too quiet. About an hour in, I came across a fork in the trail. The main path continued straight, but a narrower, less used trail branched off to the right. It wasn't marked, but something about it caught my attention. I told myself I'd just explore it for a bit before turning back. The narrow trail was harder to follow. Roots snaked across the ground, and the vegetation grew thicker. I had to push branches aside as I walked. The further I went, the more I felt like I was stepping into another world. The trees grew taller, their trunks gnarled and twisted, and the air felt heavier. Then I saw it, a structure barely visible through the trees. At first, I thought it was a large rock or maybe an old shed, but as I got closer, I realized it was a cabin. It looked ancient, the wood darkened with age and weather. The roof was sagging, and vines crawled up the walls. There was no sign of life, no trail leading to it. It seemed completely out of place. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, my footsteps crunching on the forest floor. The cabin was smaller than it had seemed from a distance. The windows were broken, and the door hung slightly ajar. I walked around the perimeter, noting the strange carvings on the wood. They weren't symbols I recognized, just random scratches and shapes, as if someone had spent years etching into the cabin's walls. The ground around the cabin was barren, devoid of plants or grass, just dry, cracked earth. Something about the place felt wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what. It wasn't fear, exactly, but an unease that settled deep in my chest. I debated leaving, but I was already there. I told myself it was just an old cabin, probably abandoned decades ago. I pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, echoing in the silence. The interior was dark, the air stale. I used my flashlight to look around. The cabin was empty except for a small wooden table and a chair in the corner. The floor was covered in dirt and debris, and the walls were lined with more of those strange carvings. On the table, there was a small, rusted tin box. I opened it carefully, half expecting something to jump out, Inside were a few old photographs, faded and torn. They showed a family, a man, a woman, and a young boy. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd see in photos from the 1930s or 1940s. One photo stood out. It showed the cabin, but it looked different. The wood was fresh, the roof intact, and smoke curled from the chimney. The family stood in front of it, smiling. There was something unsettling about their expressions. The smiles were wide, too wide, as if they were forced. I put the photos back and closed the box. The unease I'd felt earlier was now a heavy weight pressing down on me. I decided it was time to leave. As I turned to go, I heard a sound behind me, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. My heart jumped, and I swung the flashlight around, but the cabin was empty. I told myself it was just the wind or an animal outside. I stepped out of the cabin and onto the trail. The forest seemed darker than before, the shadows deeper. I quickened my pace, eager to put distance between myself and the cabin. That's when I noticed something strange. The trail didn't look the same. The trees were different, closer together, their branches arching over the path like a tunnel. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just disoriented. But the further I walked, the more I realized I wasn't on the same trail. There were no forks, no landmarks I recognized. It was as if the forest had shifted while I was in the cabin. Panic set in. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same. The trees loomed over me, their twisted branches blocking out the sky. I could feel the sweat dripping down my back, my breaths coming faster. After what felt like hours of wandering, I stumbled back onto the dirt road. Relief flooded me as I saw my car parked where I'd left it. I practically ran to it, throwing my bag into the passenger seat before starting the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement near the cabin, a shadow slipping between the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I didn't stop to look closer. I made it back to Bogota that evening, but the experience stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stepped into something I wasn't supposed to see. I never found San Mateo on a map, and when I asked locals about the trail, they just looked at me blankly. Months later, back home, I developed the photographs I'd taken during my trip. Most of them were normal pictures of the city, the mountains, the forests. But one photo was different. It showed the cabin, the same way I'd seen it. Old, decayed, and surrounded by barren ground. But there was something else in the photo. In the window of the cabin, barely visible, was the silhouette of a person. They weren't there when I took the picture. I don't know what I walked into that day, but I've never gone hiking alone again. And sometimes, late at night, I think about that cabin and the family in the photograph. I wonder if they ever left, or if they're still there, waiting for someone else to find them. It was a cold, rainy afternoon in late October, the kind of rain that seemed to seep into your bones, no matter how many layers you wore. My wife, Rachel, and I had driven 2 hours out of the city to meet with Thomas, the general manager of one of our company's most remote branches. The meeting was supposed to discuss some internal issues, numbers that didn't add up, a few whispers of misconduct, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I'd had since this trip was first scheduled. Something about the whole thing felt off. The road to the cabin, Thomas's private office, he called it, was a narrow, winding trail that cut through dense woods. Rain hammered against the windshield as I navigated cautiously, the tires occasionally slipping on the slick, muddy surface. Rachel sat quietly beside me, staring out at the trees. Her silence didn't bother me. We both preferred quiet when things felt tense. When we finally arrived, the cabin was barely visible through the rain and fog. It was smaller than I expected, more like an old hunting lodge than an office. The wooden structure looked worn, with dark streaks from years of exposure to the elements. A single light glowed faintly from inside, casting long shadows on the porch. We parked the car and made a dash for the door, our shoes sinking into the wet ground. By the time we reached the porch, we were drenched. I knocked, then pushed the door open when no one answered. The inside was warmer than I anticipated, the heat from a wood-burning stove spreading through the room. The smell of damp wood mixed with something faintly metallic, a smell I couldn't quite place. Thomas greeted us with a nod and gestured for us to sit. His desk was a makeshift setup, little more than a folding table cluttered with papers and a laptop. The rest of the cabin was sparsely furnished. A few chairs, an old sofa, and a filing cabinet that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. A large window behind Thomas's desk revealed the forest outside, though the rain blurred everything into a gray haze. I noticed a stack of folders on the table, each marked with a date. Some of them were recent, this year, this month even. Others went back over a decade. I couldn't help but wonder why he kept such old records here, in the middle of nowhere. The meeting started uneventfully. Thomas reviewed the issues we'd come to discuss, flipping through the papers and showing us charts and reports. Rachel took notes while I tried to follow along, though my mind kept wandering. The rain, the isolation, the strange smell, it all made it hard to focus. As Thomas talked, I noticed something strange about him. He was tense, more so than I'd ever seen him. His movements were sharp, his eyes darting to the window every few minutes. It was like he was waiting for something or someone. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a tightness that put me on edge too. At one point, I glanced at Rachel. She was focused on her notes, but I could tell she felt it too. Her pen paused occasionally, her eyes flicking to Thomas and then back to her notebook. About halfway through the meeting, there was a loud thud from the back of the cabin. It wasn't thunder, it was too sharp, too sudden. Thomas froze mid-sentence, his eyes wide. He glanced at the window, then at the door leading to the back room. For a moment, no one moved. What was that? I finally asked, breaking the silence. But Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and walked toward the back room, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. Rachel and I exchanged a glance, and I could see the unease in her eyes. The sound came again, louder this time. It was followed by a scraping noise, like metal against wood. Thomas disappeared into the back room, and the door closed behind him. The sound stopped. We sat there in silence, listening to the rain and the occasional creak of the cabin. Minutes passed, but Thomas didn't return. I stood up, unsure of what to do. Rachel grabbed my arm, her grip firm. She didn't say anything, but the look on her face was clear. Stay here. Ignoring her, I walked to the back room and opened the door. The room was dark, the only light coming from a small, barred window. It was empty, except for a metal cabinet against the wall. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. Thomas! I called out, my voice echoing slightly. No response. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room. That's when I noticed the floor. It wasn't just wood. There were faint marks, like scratches, leading to the cabinet. I hesitated, then walked over to it. The cabinet was old and rusted, its doors slightly ajar. I opened it, and the smell hit me immediately. It was the same metallic scent from earlier, but stronger. Inside were tools, hammers, wrenches, and something that looked like a bolt cutter. They were clean, but the cabinet itself was stained. Dark, dried stains that made my stomach turn. I closed the cabinet and stepped back, my heart pounding. Something wasn't right. I left the room and found Rachel standing by the door, her coat on. She gestured for me to follow, and I didn't argue. We walked back to the car in silence, the rain soaking us once again. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the cabin. The light in the window flickered, then went out. We drove away without speaking, the weight of what we'd seen or hadn't seen settling over us. Later, I tried to follow up with Thomas. His phone went straight to voicemail and emails went unanswered. When I called the company's headquarters, they told me he'd resigned. No explanation, no forwarding address. Just gone. Weeks later, I couldn't get the image of that cabinet out of my head. I didn't know what had happened in that cabin or what Thomas had been so afraid of, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly avoided something terrible. The rain, the scratches, the tools. It all stayed with me, a puzzle I couldn't solve. And then one day a package arrived at our office. No return address, just my name scrawled on the front. Inside was a single item, one of the folders from Thomas's desk. The date on the cover was from last year, but the papers inside were blank. All except for one. It was a photo, grainy, black and white, but unmistakable. It was the back room of the cabin, and standing in the doorway was Thomas, staring directly at the camera. His face was pale, his expression blank, but his eyes, they were wide, terrified, and locked onto something just out of frame. It was the summer of 2006, and I was 27 years old. I'd been going through a tough time, so when my uncle mentioned he needed someone to watch over an old farm cabin he owned while he was out of town for a few weeks, I jumped at the chance. The farm was in northern Montana, about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. I wasn't particularly outdoorsy, but the idea of some peace and quiet away from everything sounded perfect. The cabin was old, built sometime in the 1920s, and it showed its age. It sat at the edge of a sprawling field bordered by dense woods. The nearest neighbor was at least 2 miles down the dirt road, and there wasn't much in the way of modern conveniences. No internet, no TV, and only a weak signal on my flip phone. But I didn't mind. I had brought books, a journal, and enough supplies to last the entire 2 weeks. When I first arrived, the place felt cozy despite its age. The wood creaked under my boots, and the faint smell of dampness lingered in the air. The main room had a small kitchen area, a worn-out couch, and a dining table. The bedroom was just big enough for a bed and a dresser. There was also a small bathroom, though the water pressure was laughable, and the pipes groaned every time I used the sink. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time reading, jotting down thoughts in my journal, and taking short walks around the property. The nights were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. The solitude was comforting, and I began to feel at ease. On the 5th night, something changed. I had just gone to bed when I heard a noise outside. It was faint, like the sound of someone walking through dry grass. I dismissed it as a deer or some other animal and tried to fall asleep. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, like heavy boots crunching on the ground. My heart started to race as I lay there, straining to hear. Finally, I got up, grabbed the flashlight I kept by the bed, and peeked out the window. The beam of light swept across the yard, but I didn't see anything. The noise stopped as soon as I looked, and after a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself I was imagining things. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and went back to bed. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to see if there were any signs of an animal. The grass near the front porch was trampled, but that could have been from me unloading my supplies earlier in the week. Still, something about it didn't sit right. I decided to keep the flashlight and a kitchen knife within reach, just in case. That night, the noises started again, this time earlier in the evening. I was sitting on the couch, reading, when I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch. My blood ran cold as I froze, listening. The steps were slow, deliberate, and heavy. I didn't dare move. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, there was a soft thud, like something had been dropped on the porch. I forced myself to stand and approach the window. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The porch was empty, but there was something lying near the door. It looked like a bundle of sticks tied together with twine. My stomach churned. I didn't open the door to investigate. Instead, I sat back down, gripping the knife tightly. I stayed awake all night, jumping at every creak and groan the old cabin made. The following morning, I found the bundle still there. It was indeed a bunch of sticks tied in a strange, almost decorative pattern. I couldn't make sense of it. Who would leave something like that, and why? I tossed it into the fire pit outside and tried to put it out of my mind. But things only got worse. Over the next few days, the noises continued, and I began to feel like I was being watched. Sometimes, during the day, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye near the tree line. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. At night, I would hear faint whispers, though I could never make out the words. It felt like they were coming from the woods, carried on the wind. On the 10th day, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my things and planned to leave early the next morning. That night, as I was finishing up, I heard the footsteps again, this time circling the cabin. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the grass. Then came the sound of scratching, like nails dragging across the wooden walls. I locked myself in the bedroom, clutching the knife, and waited. Hours passed, and the noises stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. Just before dawn, I heard a loud bang on the front door, like someone pounding with their fists. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After what felt like an eternity, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. As the first light of morning broke, I cautiously opened the bedroom door and crept to the front. The door was still shut, but there were deep gouges in the wood, as if someone had been clawing at it. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The air was cold, and the grass was damp with dew. I didn't see anyone, but on the porch was another bundle of sticks, identical to the first. I didn't stay to investigate. I threw my bags into the car and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't look back, not even once. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. I told my uncle about the strange events when he returned, but he just shrugged it off, saying the area had always been a little odd. I haven't been back to that cabin since, and I don't plan to. Some things are better left unexplained. I've lived in the woods for 5 years now. 5 long, isolated years. When people ask why I made such a drastic change, they don't get it. I was tired of the noise, the chaos, the endless pressure of living in the city. I wanted peace, a place where I could live without the constant hum of traffic or the glow of streetlights outside my window. So, at 28, I bought a small piece of land in northern Maine. It came with a rundown cabin and nothing else. I didn't care. Felt like freedom. For the first year, everything was bliss. I rebuilt the cabin, slowly learning how to do repairs on my own. I chopped wood, set up a water collection system, and learned to live without modern comforts. I spent my days hiking, fishing in the nearby stream, and reading books by candlelight. It wasn't easy, but it was satisfying. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. By the second year, I had settled into a rhythm. Winters were harsh and long, but I managed. Summers were hot, but I had the shade of the trees. I got used to the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant howls of coyotes, the occasional crack of branches. I rarely saw other people. Sometimes hunters passed by, or hikers stumbled upon my cabin by accident. I kept my interactions brief. This was my place, my sanctuary. One evening in late autumn, something strange happened. I was out splitting firewood when I heard a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, just a distant thudding. I stopped, axe in hand, and listened. The sound grew louder, more rhythmic. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It sounded like footsteps, heavy ones. I glanced around, but the woods were empty. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. The footsteps stopped. I waited for a moment, then went back to work, my heart pounding harder than it should have been. That night, I locked the door to my cabin, a habit I didn't always bother with. The next morning, I found something strange near the edge of my property. A single footprint, larger than any I'd ever seen, pressed deep into the mud. It wasn't a boot print. It looked more like a bare foot, but it was far too big to be human. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a bear stepping oddly. Maybe it was my imagination. I had no neighbors to talk to about it, no one to share my unease. So I buried the thought and went about my day. Weeks passed, and the unease grew. I started noticing more signs. Twigs snapped in strange patterns, odd gouges on tree trunks, and most unnerving of all, the faint sound of something moving outside my cabin at night. It wasn't every night, but often enough that I started to dread sundown. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the cabin making my heart race. One night, I finally got up the courage to look. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window. First, I saw nothing, just the dark woods, silent and still. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw movement. Something big was walking between the trees, its silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall, too tall to be a person, but it moved like one. I froze, unable to breathe. It didn't come closer, just stood there, swaying slightly. After what felt like an eternity, it turned and disappeared into the woods. By the 5th year, I was exhausted. Whatever was out there didn't leave. It didn't attack me or try to get into the cabin, but it was always there, watching. I started finding more footprints, always near the edges of my property. I set up makeshift traps, hoping to catch whatever it was, or at least scare it off, but they were always sprung with no sign of what had triggered them. One morning, I woke up to find something leaning against my front door. It was a stick, stripped of its bark, with strange carvings etched into it. It was deliberate, intentional. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call the police. What would I tell them? That some mysterious figure was stalking me in the woods? They'd think I was crazy. That night, I decided to stay up and keep watch. I sat by the window with my shotgun, staring out into the dark. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just as I was about to give up, I saw it again. This time, it was closer. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. I raised the shotgun, my hands shaking, and pointed it at the figure. But I didn't pull the trigger, because as I stared at it, I realized something terrifying. It wasn't a person, but it wasn't an animal either. Its proportions were wrong, arms too long, head too small, legs bent at an unnatural angle. It looked like it had been human once, but something had changed it. I stayed frozen in place, my finger hovering over the trigger. The thing tilted its head, almost like it was studying me, then turned and walked back into the woods. The next morning, I packed up everything I could carry. I left the cabin, my home for 5 years, without looking back. I don't know what I saw, and I don't want to know. Some things aren't meant to be understood. I moved to a small town far away from those woods, but I still dream about them sometimes. I dream about the thing standing outside my cabin, watching me, and sometimes I wake up with the feeling that it's still watching. I pulled up to the old cabin, a place tucked away in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. The air felt heavy, the kind of weight that settles before a storm. It had been years since I'd last spoken to Jason, my ex-husband. We had met in the army, him a sergeant, me barely out of boot camp. He was sharp, disciplined, and stubborn as hell. Our marriage didn't survive his deployments, and truth be told, I didn't think I'd ever see him again. But a cryptic letter, and signed but unmistakably his handwriting, brought me here. The cabin stood alone on a forgotten trail. Jason had bought it after he left the service. He once told me it was his escape plan, a place to disappear when the world got too loud. As I got out of my car, I noticed how rundown it looked. The roof sagged slightly, moss covered the wooden walls, and the front steps creaked under my weight. It didn't seem like anyone had been here in years. I had to push the door hard to get it open, the wood swollen from years of rain. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and mildew. The living room was sparse. A single couch, a small coffee table, and a wood-burning stove. A faint layer of dust covered everything, but there were signs of recent activity. A coffee cup sat on the table, its rim stained with a dark liquid. A jacket, military-issued, hung on the back of a chair. I called out for him but got no answer. The silence inside the cabin was suffocating. It didn't feel like an empty silence. It felt like something was waiting. I shook off the unease and began to explore. The bedroom was as bare as the living room. A twin-sized cot with a rumpled blanket, a duffel bag half-zipped with clothes spilling out, and a hunting rifle propped against the wall. A map pinned to the wall caught my eye. It was marked with red circles and lines, all centering on this area of the forest. Notes were scribbled in the margins, coordinates, dates, and cryptic phrases like noise at 0200 and tracks NW Ridge. I couldn't make sense of it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something about this felt wrong. Jason was meticulous, almost obsessive about his routines. For him to leave things scattered like this wasn't normal. I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the clearing. That's when I saw them, tracks in the dirt. Not footprints exactly, but impressions that looked like they'd been made by something heavy being dragged. They led from the back of the cabin into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees closing in until barely any light reached the ground. The air was colder here, and every sound, leaves crunching underfoot, branches creaking in the wind, felt amplified. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, certain I wasn't alone. The tracks ended at a clearing. In the center was a pit, about 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep. It wasn't natural. The edges were too clean, like it had been dug with tools. A shovel lay nearby, its blade dirty. Something about the pit made my stomach turn. I forced myself to look inside. It was empty, but the smell, metallic and sharp, was unmistakable. Blood. The dirt at the bottom was dark and wet. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What the hell was Jason involved in? A rustling sound came from the trees. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The forest was too dense, shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I hurried back to the cabin, my chest tight with panic. Back inside, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone, but of course, there was no signal. The nearest town was miles away, and night was falling fast. I decided to wait until morning. Whatever was happening, I didn't want to be out in those woods after dark. I lit the stove and sat on the couch, every creak of the cabin making me jump. I tried to make sense of it all, the letter, the tracks, the pit. None of it added up. Jason wasn't the type to get involved in something messy. He was calculated, always thinking 10 steps ahead. Around midnight, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like an animal growling, but deeper. It came from the direction of the woods. I froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't just one noise. There were multiple low murmurs, the crunch of leaves, and something that sounded like heavy breathing. I moved to the window, careful not to make a sound. The moonlight illuminated the clearing, and that's when I saw them. Figures, 5 or 6 of them, moving in the shadows. They were human, but their movements were jerky, almost unnatural. They circled the cabin, their heads turning sharply, like they were looking for something. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. My mind screamed at me to do something. Hide, run, fight. But I was paralyzed. Then, a loud thud against the door broke the spell. I grabbed the hunting rifle from the bedroom and chambered around, my hands trembling. The thudding continued, each hit harder than the last. The chair under the door handle groaned, the wood splintering. I aimed the rifle at the door, my finger on the trigger. The moment the door gave way, I fired. The blast echoed through the cabin, and for a moment, there was silence. Then chaos. They poured into the room, moving faster than I thought possible. I fired again and again, but there were too many. They didn't scream or shout, just made those awful guttural noises. I fought my way to the back door, barely managing to escape into the night. I ran blindly, the forest a blur around me. The sounds of pursuit were close, branches snapping, feet pounding against the earth. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran before I stumbled upon an old fire road. Headlights appeared in the distance, and I threw myself in front of the truck. The driver slammed on the brakes, and I begged him to take me to the nearest town. When I reached the sheriff's office, I told them everything. A deputy accompanied me back to the cabin at dawn, but when we arrived, it was empty. No bares, no trucks, no beach. The place looked like no one had been there in years. Even Jason's things were gone. The sheriff chalked it up to hysteria, maybe a bad dream. But I know what I saw, what I heard. Jason's map, his notes, they were warnings. Something was out there in those woods, something dangerous. And now it knows my face. It was late October when I decided to take a break from the noise of city life. Work had been draining, and the constant hum of traffic outside my apartment was a reminder that I needed an escape. I rented a small cabin deep in the forests of northern Michigan. The listing was simple: a rustic one-bedroom cabin with a fireplace, surrounded by acres of untouched woods. Sounded perfect. I arrived on a crisp Thursday afternoon. The drive itself had been peaceful. No cars for miles, just the road winding through dense trees that looked like they belonged in a postcard. The cabin was exactly as described. A simple wooden structure with a pitched roof and a small porch. There was a stack of firewood on the side and a stone chimney that gave it an old-time charm. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and stepped inside. The interior was cozy but sparse. A small kitchen with a basic stove and sink, a living area with a worn-out couch and a coffee table, and a bedroom with a single bed and an old wooden dresser. The bathroom was functional but tiny. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and the nearest town was about 30 miles away. That was the whole point, though, to disconnect. I spent the first evening settling in. I unpacked, lit a fire in the fireplace, and cooked a simple meal on the stove. The silence was strange at first. I wasn't used to the absence of sound. No cars, no voices, no electronics. Just the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant rustling of leaves outside. I told myself it was peaceful, but it also felt isolating. That night, I slept surprisingly well. The bed was old, but the mattress was firm, and the heavy quilt kept the chill at bay. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the small window above the bed. I made coffee, stepped out onto the porch, and breathed in the crisp morning air. The forest was beautiful. The trees were a mix of red, orange, and yellow, their leaves carpeting the ground. A light breeze carried the scent of pine and damp earth. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin. There was no trail, but the forest was easy enough to navigate. I came across a small creek about half a mile from the cabin and decided to follow it for a while. It meandered through the woods, the water clear and cold. I spotted a few deer in the distance and even saw a hawk circling overhead. It felt good to be out in nature, away from the stress of my everyday life. By late afternoon, I made my way back to the cabin. I was tired, but in a good way. After a quick meal, I lit another fire and settled onto the couch with a book. The warmth of the fire and the soft glow of the flames made the cabin feel like a safe haven. I went to bed that night feeling content. The next morning, I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was something else. A rhythmic tapping coming from outside. I got out of bed and looked out the window, but I didn't see anything. The forest was still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I told myself it was probably a branch knocking against the side of the cabin. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things. The way the woods felt quieter than usual. The way I kept thinking I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned my head. I chalked it up to my imagination and tried to focus on enjoying my time in the cabin. That night, the tapping returned. This time, it was louder and more persistent. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside to investigate. The cold night air hit me immediately, and I shivered as I scanned the area. The forest was pitch black beyond the beam of my flashlight. I walked around the cabin, checking for anything out of the ordinary, but everything looked fine. No branches against the walls, no animals scurrying away. I went back inside, bolted the door, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. The next day, I decided to go further into the woods. I thought maybe I'd find some sign of wildlife or at least distract myself from the unease that had started to creep in. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and headed out. The forest was denser the further I went, the trees growing closer together and the underbrush thicker. The air felt heavier, and the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy above. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled across something strange. A clearing, surrounded by trees, with a pile of rocks in the center. The rocks were stacked deliberately, forming a small cairn. It looked old, moss growing between the stones, but it was clear someone had placed them there. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest town was miles away, and the woods didn't have any trails or campsites. I stood there for a while, staring at the cairn, before I decided to head back. As I turned to leave, I noticed something else. The forest was silent, completely silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing. I hurried back to the cabin, my heart pounding. That night, I couldn't sleep. The tapping had started again, but this time, it was joined by another sound. A low, guttural noise that I couldn't identify. Came from the woods, faint but distinct. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I decided to leave. The unease I'd been feeling had turned into a deep sense of dread. I packed my things, loaded the car, and started the drive back to the city. As I left the cabin behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest seemed darker, more menacing, as if it was alive and aware of me. When I finally got home, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief that I was safe, but guilt that I had abandoned the cabin, left it behind like it was a mistake. A few weeks later, I looked up the area online. hoping to find some explanation for what I'd experienced. What I found sent a shiver down my spine. The forest had a history. Decades ago, it had been home to a small community that vanished without a trace. Their homes had been reclaimed by the woods, and all that remained were stories of strange noises and unexplained disappearances. The cairn I'd found was likely a marker, left behind by the missing villagers. I haven't been back to the woods since, and I don't plan to. The cabin still haunts my dreams, its walls echoing with the sound of tapping and the low, guttural noise of something waiting in the dark. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. Some places are meant to be left alone. I always preferred staying indoors during storms. Rain never really bothered me, but something about thunder and lightning put me on edge. That's why I wasn't thrilled when my friend, Dave, suggested I borrow his family's old cabin for a weekend getaway. I had been working nonstop and needed a break, he said. I resisted at first, but eventually gave in. A secluded cabin sounded like a peaceful retreat. Besides, I'd never been one to turn down free lodging. The cabin was a few hours outside of the city, deep in the woods near a place called Cedar Ridge. Dave warned me it was a little old and not the most modern, but it had running water, electricity, and enough charm to make up for any shortcomings. I packed light, just some clothes, snacks, and a couple of books to keep me entertained. It was early October of 2016 when I arrived. The leaves were vibrant shades of orange and red, and the crisp air smelled faintly of pine. The cabin itself was small but cozy, with dark wood siding and a steep roof. A narrow porch wrapped around the front, and an old rocking chair sat just to the left of the door. Inside, it was basic but functional. A small kitchenette sat to one side with a table and two mismatched chairs. The living area had a couch that looked older than me and a wood-burning stove. The bedroom was just big enough for a double bed and a dresser. There was even a tiny bathroom with a shower that barely looked like it worked. It wasn't much, but it would do for the weekend. I spent most of that first day exploring the area around the cabin. The woods were dense and quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves as squirrels or birds moved about. A narrow trail led down to a small creek, where the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. I thought about how nice it would be to sit by the creek with a book, just listening to the water. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sky had turned a deep gray. Rain was on its way. I went inside, lit a fire in the stove, and made a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers. The sound of rain started as a soft patter on the roof, but soon grew into a steady drumming. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the cabin's windows. I didn't think much of it at first. Storms like this weren't uncommon in the area. I settled onto the couch with one of my books and tried to ignore the way the wind seemed to push against the cabin, making the walls creak. Around 9 p.m., the power flickered, came back on quickly but flickered again a few minutes later. I sighed and grabbed the flashlight I'd brought just in case. By the time the power went out for good, I was already lighting a couple of candles I'd found in the kitchen. The warm glow of the flames made the cabin feel smaller, more intimate, but it also deepened the shadows in the corners. The rain was coming down hard now, and the wind was relentless. The windows rattled so much I half expected them to shatter. I tried to focus on my book, but the storm was too distracting. Every gust of wind seemed to carry a new noise. Branches snapping, something scraping against the roof, the occasional thud of what I assumed were pine cones or debris hitting the walls. By 10 p.m., I was starting to feel uneasy. The storm wasn't letting up, and the cabin felt increasingly isolated. I decided to call it a night. I double-checked that the doors and windows were locked, then crawled into bed. The wind howled outside, and the rain lashed against the cabin. It was hard to sleep with all the noise, but eventually, exhaustion won out. I was just starting to drift off when I heard a sound that didn't belong. A sharp, deliberate knock on the front door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was probably a branch or something loose being thrown against the cabin by the wind. But then it happened again, 3 loud, deliberate knocks. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My mind raced through every possibility. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere in this storm? After a long moment, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy steps that moved across the wooden boards. Whoever it was stopped right outside the bedroom window. I stared at the window, waiting to see a face or a shadow, but nothing happened. The steps moved again, back toward the front door, then around the side of the cabin. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, but the deliberate knocks and the weight of the footsteps told me otherwise. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept out of bed, my heart pounding. The cabin was eerily quiet, save for the storm outside. I checked the locks again, even though I knew they hadn't been touched. I stood there in the dark, listening for any sound of movement. The footsteps returned, this time circling the cabin. I heard them move toward the back door, then stop. I held my breath, straining to hear. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain and wind. Then a loud crash. The back door burst open, slamming against the wall. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, its beam casting wild shadows. I didn't wait to see who or what had broken in. I bolted for the front door, throwing it open and running into the storm. The rain was icy cold, soaking me to the bone within seconds. I didn't stop to think. I just ran. The woods were pitch black, the rain making it nearly impossible to see. I tripped over roots and slipped on wet leaves, but I kept going. I didn't know where I was running to. I just knew I had to get away. Eventually, I found myself at the creek. I followed it downstream, hoping it would lead me to the road. My legs ached, and my lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, or something, chasing me. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the road. I stumbled onto the pavement, waving my arms desperately when I saw headlights approaching. The car screeched to a stop, and I collapsed onto the hood, gasping for air. The driver, a local man heading home, helped me into his car and called the police. I told them everything, though I wasn't sure they believed me. By the time they reached the cabin, whoever had been there was gone. The back door was broken, just as I'd said, but there were no other signs of forced entry. No footprints, no evidence of anyone else being there. The police chalked it up to the storm and said I'd probably scared myself. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. To this day, I don't know who or what was outside that cabin. But I haven't been back to Cedar Ridge since, and I doubt I ever will.